Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is proud to present today's program about Wixárika Huichol yarn painting as the first in a series to accompany our new digital initiative, Vital Matters, Stories of Belief, a platform for sharing different perspectives on devotional works at the Fowler Museum, generously supported by a grant from Lilly Endowment Inc. Vital Matters programs explore objects that arouse devotion, awe, or serenity, mediate relationships between human and spiritual realms, and are of vital importance to the cultural heritage of individuals and communities. Today, we are taking the Fowler's exquisite yarn painting by José Benítez Sánchez as a point of departure. We are pleased to be welcoming educator and curator Diana Negrín, who will provide context for its symbolism as it relates to Wixárika culture, history, and territory. Negrin will also speak with yarn artist and daughter of Benitez, Maymi. Together, they will provide insight into Benitez's practice as an artist and shaman, pointing to his background as a Wixárika migrant in Tepic and his relationship to Juan Negrín, who promoted and collected Benitez's art and became his companion on numerous pilgrimages. We'll wrap up with audience question and answer moderated by our senior curator of Latin American and Caribbean popular arts, Patrick Polk, who is also co-director along with our director of education and interpretation, Amy Landau, of the Fowler's Lilly Endowment Project, Engaging Lived Religion in the 21st Century Museum. Before we get going, a little bit about our guests. Diana Negrín is a geographer, writer, educator, and curator who focuses on land and social movements in the Wixárika territories of Mexico and of Abya Yala more generally. Her scholarship engages human and cultural geography, critical race theory, cultural studies, political ecology, and urban studies. She's the author of Racial Alterity, Wixárika Youth Activism and the Right to the Mexican City, published by University of Arizona Press in 2019. Between 2008 and 2010, Negrin co-curated a series of exhibits at Pueblo Nuevo, a community art space in Berkeley, California. More recently, she has worked with her family's unique Wixárika art collection, most notably through the Gran Maestros del Arte Wixárika, Acervo Negrin exhibit at the Museo Cabañas in Guadalajara. Maymi Benitez is a contemporary Wixárika artist based in Tepic, Nayarit, Mexico, and daughter of the late artist José Benítez Sánchez. She has built upon her father's innovative yarn painting techniques, establishing herself as one of the preeminent contemporary Wixárika artists. I just have a few quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, please click View Options and then select Side-by-Side mode so the feed doesn't cover any of the presentation. If you have any questions during the program, please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote questions you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. Okay, that's enough from me. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Bianca, Patrick, Amy, the Fowler Museum, UCLA, and also I want to thank Maymi Benitez. I want to thank you all for making this event possible, for asking us to participate, and especially to Maymi Benitez for being a part of this conversation. I join you all from Oakland, California, unceded Huichol Ohlone territory. And I'm really excited to share, I think, some background and some context for one of the most amazing Mexican contemporary artists that I believe we have. And I think this is especially important at this, during these dates when we're thinking about the meanings of colonialism and decolonization more and more. So if we could see the first slide, please. The man that we see in this photo, José Benítez Sánchez, or Yucauye Cucame, is today's protagonist, our ancestor. He's a trailblazing artist, father, innovator, whose legacy shaped Wixárika's contemporary art. And I think it's a particularly important conversation to be having, given that Mexico has in many ways centered itself as one of the major centers of art production in the Americas, in Abya Yala. But at the same time, we know very few of Mexico's indigenous artists. Who has heard of Diego Rivera or Frida Kahlo, right? If we were in an audience all together, I'm sure most hands would go up. Have any of you heard of Francisco Toledo? Maria Izquierdo. Mexico is vibrant, artistic, colorful, right? Many of us are more than familiar with Frida's brows and Diego Rivera's calla lilies. We may even be familiar with the indigenous cultures they were inspired by. But do people know that they once painted portraits of Wixárika men who they spotted on the streets of Mexico City and invited to their house? Who were they painting and why? So today I want to share a bit more about someone who I believe represents the best of Mexico's 20th century artistic creation. But I believe that because of white supremacy, paternalism, and the lack of spaces available for indigenous artists, not just in Mexico, but globally, few of us know about Yucairie Cucame. So I hope that today that begins to change. Slide 2, please. I want to depart with this painting. This is the center of the Fowler's Vital Matters and up and coming exhibit that I will also be happy to participate in. And this is a piece that José Benítez created in 2005 during his kind of late period of creation. And what I want to point to here, we're going to see a series of slides of his artwork. And this is really, I would say, this piece really captures the essence of his trademark aesthetic of his figures. And I want to point to the symbology that is very important, not just in José Benítez's paintings, but in other Wixárika artists' paintings, right? What we see often are the depictions of characters and symbols that are central within Wixárika worldview cosmogony. So we see the deer, we see deer people, right? And the deer in Wixárika worldview is our elder brother. So oftentimes what we see are what we kind of this nahualismo, right? Where there's a shift between the human and the animal, and they are one and the same. We also see peyote, which is a sacred plant. We see arrows, we see eagles, antlers, snakes, corn, right? So all of these are very important symbols that get repeated time and again, but they get repeated in these paintings in different formats, right? In different sequences. And what's fascinating about the work that José Benítez did is that he blended in these very rich narratives and had them all kind of in this one time and space, but in actuality, they were representing various times and spaces. They were storytelling, visual storytelling. So this particular painting is going to be, again, worked on, and hopefully we can bring a lot more focus into the symbology as the months go. But I wanted to share with you all today the evolution of José Benítez's work. How is it that he got to this particular kind of trademark style that he had? Next, please. So this is one of his earliest paintings from 1972, The Four Aspects of the Spirit. And with all of these paintings, you will see a Wixárika translation of the title. This is a typical 24 by 24 inch painting. And it seems quite different in many ways from his more elaborate style that he developed in the 1980s and 90s. What is really central here and what I want to flag is the importance of what he's representing. It may seem very simple, but in reality, this is an aspect, this is a painting that depicts both the spiritual world and the territory that is so central to Wixárika practice, ceremonial practice, the five sacred places that we'll keep revisiting in the next few minutes. So this particular painting really brings together how both our bodies and the territory, the larger territory that we live in, are one and the same, happen to kind of coexist in a parallel world. And for Benitez, much of the content of his work focused on this interaction between the self and the territory and all of the different ancestors that are part of that territory. Next. This piece is Tatewari's altar, Grandfather Fire. Once again, it's very distinct from his later work. There's a lot more kind of what one would call open space, but you really start to see him working on this technique, which is yarn on beeswax and wood, and carrying these deep symbols You see the peyote cactuses below Tatewari, grandfather fire. You see again these antlers. And from the grandfather fire's hands, you see the way in which you have these feathered arrows that are used for healing by the shaman. Next. The next two paintings, I think, are some of the most phenomenal of his masterworks. And what I wanted to point out here is that what he's trying to do is also depict these different ancestors that are very central to Wixárika worldview. So this first one is the dismemberment of Takutsi-Nakawe, who's our great grandmother of growth. And she had the hollow ear. She was able to foretell when the great flood was coming and to bring and collect the seeds and the different animals in order for them to return after the flood. And in this particular piece, it's what I call my lessons in anatomy when I was a child. I remember spending a lot of time looking at it and trying to figure out each one of the body parts. But Takutsi-Nakawe is deeply, deeply tied. This female, she's almost also, I would say, an androgynous ancestor, is deeply connected to the next slide, which is Watakame. Next. And this is the dismemberment of Watakame, who's the first cultivator. So after the flood, he's the one that then sows the first seeds once again. And again, we see them as they're a type of pair. They have a partnership within this ancestor world. And once again, you see this very interesting work that he did around the dismemberment of this ancestor, his body in space. And I think that both on a personal level as a practicing artist, as well as in the content of his paintings, José Benítez was constantly putting the self into dialogue with the broader world. Next. Now this painting, right, those were from the 1970s, and we see a certain kind of evolution there. The colors, the way in which he's working with space. But by the 1980s, he really starts to crystallize what became his style, his quintessential trademark style, those characters that many artists have since worked on and been inspired from. So this particular piece represents Tateya Tsinari, our mother, the coiled serpent of corn gruel or atole. And I always like to look at this as a form of cartography, as a type of map of the Wixárika ancestor world and the territory, those ancestral sacred territories that they still travel to and place offerings at since time immemorial. And the figures that you see around the snake represent some of these distinct ancestors, including Takutsi-Nakawe and Watakame. But also one of the things that's really central in Wixárika aesthetic is the role of the serpent. And in Wixárika mythology, it is understood that the serpents traveled underground, right? And they connect all of the different sacred places together through the rivers and the creeks. And so there's this beautiful way of depicting both the environment, flora, fauna, but also our particular relationship to that environment. So today's pilgrims continue to trace the steps of those serpents, of those ancestors, in order to keep what they call the candles of life going. And in a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about why this is so important, given current crises that we are experiencing as a people, not just the Wixárika people, but as a broader global people. Next, please. This painting now looks really small in the slide, but this is an example of one of the largest format paintings that he worked on. They're 122 by 244 meters. And here what I love about this painting is that it also shows the centrality of female ancestors. This is the deification of Tate Hautsi-Kuburi, our mother Dusol. And you see these different ways in which the female ancestors represented her relationship, again, with the snakes that are like her children that she's feeding, right? So this relationship, again, between us and the world and nature and the environment. And in many ways, the Wixárika continue to be seen today as particularly invested in this relationship between nature and people and healing our relationship with nature through the act of walking, sacrificing, placing offerings in these different places, right? Excuse the inability to really get into the detail of these paintings. But what I want to show just at this moment and just flag for you all is the depth that he gave each one of these representations of ancestors, of places. You see in this particular painting, the jiriki, which is the temple. Those temples sometimes are sacred just for the family. It's where the family ancestors rest, but they also can be jirikis for the whole community. They can be the ancestor jiriki. And so again, José Benítez continued to work with these elements through the 1990s and early 2000s until he was finally recognized in Mexico with a national award as an artist. So this is just a quick view of that evolution. And then the next slide, what I want to get into a little bit is, you can put the next slide, please. Yes. So is a little bit more of the context. Now that we've appreciated his artistry, what was the social context that he emerged through, that he began to do this work in? And I want to highlight a couple biographical points. So José Benítez was born in 1938 in Nayarit, in a ranch in Nayarit. And in a minute, I will show you guys a map of Wixárika territory, which is in mostly Western Mexico. He was given the name Yucaye Cucame, or silent walker in the Wixárika language. His religious tradition and family ties link him to the Wixárika group of Huautla, or San Sebastián Teponahuastlan in Jalisco. He was brought up by his maternal grandfather, who died at the age of 105, leaving a strong impression on José's memory, and his stepfather, Pascual Benitez, both of whom were maracame, or shamans. Following the disciplines that his stepfather and his grandfather gave him, José Benítez began working in the fields at the age of 8. Many Wixárika have worked in the tobacco fields of Nayarit, and he was one of those individuals. And it is in many ways at that point that he was no longer able to remain in the traditional home, and he started to spend more time in the outside world, in the mestizo world, again, first as a young child laborer, but then through the years, he began to work for the government. José Benítez continued to make pilgrimages to these various sacred places in Wixárika territory, especially our mother ocean in Nayarit. And when he was 14, he basically left his family to resume work in Tepic. He told my father, "When I started working as a coastal laborer, I left my Wixárika clothes and my sandals, changing them for Mexican clothes, and I soon felt like a mestizo. I never forgot my traditional customs, but it was not the same because I had abandoned my plans for becoming a shaman." It was not long before Benitez came into contact with government agents involved in rural communities, and he began working for them in various capacities. During this time in 1963 is when he began working on his first skills making yarn paintings. And he told my father, "I could not draw the figures as they ought to be represented, but I began to think back about the lives of my grandparents, my parents, and our traditional customs." By 1968, he was recognized as one of the foremost practitioners of Wixárika arts, and he was invited to play music and dance in 1968 at the Olympics in Mexico City. In 1971, he was working for this one government program that was seeking the development of Wixárika territory through roads and kind of more capitalistic projects. And it is that time that he begins to sell his first artworks to the stores in Tepic. José Benítez at that point became the undisputed master of many original dramatic compositions, and many local craftsmen begin to emulate his style. But Benitez remained unsurpassed in the abundance and inventiveness of his art over the long span of his evolving career. This particular image is from 1986, when finally, after many years of creating works and exhibiting them, thanks to many colleagues, Juan Negrín, John Bowles, working to get these artworks displayed in spaces that weren't just galleries for tourists or ethnographic or anthropological museums. It took a tour in Europe and various modern art museums until Mexico City would finally acquiesce and decide that maybe it was valuable to host an exhibit in their Museum of Modern Art showing the work of these contemporary Wixárika artists. So José Benítez was there at this landmark moment, you know, this very important recognition of Wixárika art as contemporary Mexican art. Unfortunately, it was the last time that such an exhibit would happen in Mexico until 2019. And again, that had to do with a certain sense of where works like Benitez's belonged. Again, oftentimes relegated to anthropology museums, ethnographic spaces, and usually not depicted as contemporary art, but something that had to do with folklore and traditions, which it did as well, right? So this is, I think, very interesting because it's a problem that persists up until today. Next slide, please. So just a little backdrop in terms of how José Benítez entered the art world. In many ways, it was his relationship with his half-brother, who's here in the middle. José Benítez is on the far left, and Juan Negrín, my father, who's on the right. His half-brother, Pablo Taisan, who also was known by the name Yaoshali, was a very gifted shaman, also an artist and a musician, just like his brother, José. And it is Yaoshali who began to take my father and José to the sacred places. José felt like it was important for him to revisit his tradition, to go back to these places that he had gone to with his grandfather, with his parents, and for my father to understand the meaning of these places, because without that, he would not be able to understand the meaning of the yarn paintings that he was creating. So these three men together walked through much of Wixárika territory. They took 5 pilgrimages to Wirikuta, which is located in the Chihuahuan desert. They took those pilgrimages in a very traditional way, which is seldom done today. And that means basically walking, fasting, sometimes hopping on a train that no longer runs, passenger trains. And being able to place offerings and essentially suffer with the territory and really understand the same types of steps and paths that the ancestors had taken to keep a balance with our natural world. So it is through these pilgrimages that a dialogue was really able to deepen between Juan and José. And with the paintings that my father began to collect, he made sure to record José explaining the details. And as they walked and experienced life together and also faced the Mexican art world and the global art world together, I think they also very much deepened their understanding of what the scope of these paintings could be, what the role of etymology was, what the role of these symbols were. And as they continued to work together, that relationship and that understanding of what the content of these paintings was really began to mature. Next slide, please. What I think is also very valuable to explain about these yarn paintings is that, again, for José Benítez, it was important for him in his early years, after he depicted a particular place or a particular story, to go and leave an offering in those places that he was depicting. And this comes from the history of the yarn painting, which is rooted in the ñerika. Here in this image, we see a ñerika, which is a traditional offering that operates both as a mirror as well as a shield. And in this particular ñerika that was created by Yaoshali, his half-brother, we see a depiction of the 5 sacred places that the Wixárika must go to, right? And then in the middle, you have this mirror. And in the next slide, please. This is kind of a contemporary map, right? A map that we may be more familiar with, where you can see actually where these places are. So this is, you can see the states of Jalisco, Nayarit, Zacatecas, and San Luis Potosi. And within that, in red, the 5 main sacred places. Now, these sacred places don't exist in isolation. Each time that they are visited, they are oftentimes accompanied by leaving offerings in all other places, right? And collecting water from all 5 of these other places. And this is incredibly important to understand with relationship to the stories, the themes that are being depicted, but also to the practice of José Benítez as an artist, getting to know all of these places in more intimate ways in order to really be able to tell stories about them. So I'd like to think of these paintings as cartographies that tell us a great deal about birth and life, death, suffering, offerings, and the relationships that we have with our ancestors and our ancestral lands. And currently, what I think is really important for us as a public to understand is that this ancestral land is under threat. All 5 of these sacred sites are currently experiencing different threats. And you can have the next slide, please. Wirikuta, which is in the Chihuahuan Desert in San Luis Potosi, and is often a theme of yarn paintings because of the centrality of peyote as a sacramental cactus, as a vehicle for entering into dialogue with ancestors and with the territories that ancestors are rooted in. This is one of the areas that has gained the most attention because it is under threat by mining. Largely, we're talking about transnational Canadian mining companies, but most recently also the spread of agro industry. So we have in this picture, you can see this is a picture taken from one of the sacred mountain, the burnt peak, where it is said that the sun was born. And in the distance, you can see these parcels of land that has been deforested for tomato, cucumber, bell pepper, chili that is used for export. But in some of the other sacred lands, like in the West on the ocean, what we have there is the threat of large-scale tourism development. Again, so like resorts and the pollution of the water. And then in the South, in Chapahuillameta, where Lake Chapala is, we have a lot of real estate development and land use change that is being spurred by speculation. Especially there's a large Canadian and American expat community there who want to retire in a place like Chapala, but also wealthy Mexicans who can afford to live in these types of regions. And so again, this is a form of threat as it begins to encroach on this sacred land. And then I think a couple of other big time threats that we're seeing are drug trafficking and climate change. All of these are affecting deeply their ability to travel safely. Drug trafficking in particular has created a lot of violence and has made it difficult to access certain sacred places in the highlands in particular. And so I think it's very important in the spirit of José Benítez and also my father Juan Negrín, that these paintings also serve as a vehicle for people to learn about the importance of Wixárika territory, the importance of territory for culture, for language, right? If we find these paintings beautiful, then it's important for us to understand that without this deep culture and the ability to bring offerings to these different places, Wixárika culture ceases to exist as it is, right? Without peyote as a sacrament, there's a sense that Wixárika culture cannot remain the same. Slide 14, please. So I think we have so much at stake. And in particular, I think that there's a very important role that Indigenous artists and art hold in keeping us informed about the roles that culture, power, representation, and tradition have in their practices as artists. And this is a great moment to segue and to bring Maymi Benitez on. Maymi Benitez, ahora sí ya te voy a traer. The folks in those images were grandchildren of José Benítez. And this next segment I just really want to open the floor for Maymi Benitez to tell about her process as an artist, the role that her father had in leading her to art practice, and some of the opportunities and challenges that she faces as an artist today. Bienvenida, Maymi. I'm going to be translating, so this will be a bilingual segment of the program. Maymi, bienvenida. Quisiera saber si podrías compartir tu inicio, tu camino como artista, así como el papel que tuvo tu padre. So this first question is if she can share her path as an artist and the role her father had in influencing her.
Aku, gracias por la invitación. Me da mucho gusto estar aquí con ustedes.
Yaku,
Mi
hello.
nombre es Luciana Benítez.
She's very happy to be here with you.
Sí. En Wixárika es Maymi, que significa prohibido.
¿Prohibido?
Sí.
Her name in Wixárika is
Nombre,
which means
ese nombre me lo puso mi papá.
A name her father gave her, Wawin, which means prohibited.
Bueno, de cariño pues ya me dejó con el nombre más fácil de Maymi, y pues me quedo con ese nombre artístico que ahora me representa. En base a lo que platican con mi papá, pues les voy a platicar un poco sobre mi vida.
So her name, the name that her father gave her again is Waiweme, but he also named her Maymi out of love, and that's the name that has stuck with her, and that's her artist name is Maymi. So now she's going to tell you all a little bit about herself.
Mi interés por el arte comienza desde pequeña, pues viendo a mi papá cómo hacía esas figuras plasmando en los cuadros. Se veía pues algo difícil, pero pues él solamente entendía que era lo que plasmaba.
So her interest began as a child while she watched her father create these figures, and just her curiosity and watching his process.
Sí. Con el tiempo pues ya me fui interesando poco a poco porque él ya empezaba su fama de artista, tenía más pedidos, y ya fue cuando entramos los hijos a apoyarlo, a trabajar con él.
And with time, as her father's fame grew in the 1990s, he began to get more work commissions. And so his children, including Maymi, began to participate in the creation of these works.
Sí, y pues cuando trabajábamos, cuando le ayudábamos, él decía, espero que algún día mis hijos sigan mis pasos, porque pues es algo bonito la tradición.
And when they helped, he would often repeat to them that he hoped that one of them or several of them would follow his tradition as an artist.
Así desde pequeños nos empezó a dar cuadros para ver la habilidad que teníamos, a ver si podíamos poder plasmar lo mismo, y en base a eso pues nos iba preparando.
And when we were little, he would give us each these paintings to see our individual capacity and what it was that we could create.
Sí, pues no, casi todos los hijos les interesa el arte Wixárika, somos pocos los que hacemos cuadros de estambre Wixárika.
And even though many of the children have been interested in Wixárika art, it is only a few of them who actually have continued the practice of the yarn painting.
Yo me interesé por el arte cuando tenía ya 18 años. Me independicé porque ya era más mi interés hacia los cuadros.
And it was when she was 18 that she became an independent artist and really started to cement her interest in the yarn painting medium.
Ahora, pues gracias a él, plasmó sus enseñanzas, plasmó la tradición que nos enseñaron nuestros antepasados y que él nos dejó
And
como
it is
herencia.
And it is thanks to him that I now depict his teachings, the content that he was taught, our ancestors.
Hoy en mi vida, pues soy una artista que quiere seguir los pasos de su padre, José Benítez Sánchez, obras que tienen que seguir adelante, tienen que salir todavía el nombre de José Benítez en delante.
And today, in my life, I'm an artist who I try to keep his legacy alive. I try to keep his name alive.
Hoy por hoy, pues ya mis obras, gracias a él, he hecho obras del más pequeño al más grande, obras en las que se están extendiendo pues, a nivel ya nacional.
And she feels that it's thanks to him that that she's been able to create works that range in size from small to large, and now she's gaining some national attention for her work.
Estoy aquí trabajando en mi comunidad indígena Zitácua de aquí de Tepic, México, en la casa de mi padre.
And she continues to work in her father's house in Colonia Zitácua en Tepic. And just as a side note, voy a explicar un poco que tu papá tiene mucho que ver con la fundación de Zitácua y si quieres añadir más. Zitácua is a neighborhood in Tepic that was founded by her father. It was a neighborhood that was populated by many displaced Wixárika that had been displaced by dam construction. And in the late 80s, he organized for the city to recognize it as an official Wixárika neighborhood. So, not only was he an artist, but he also worked to create a dignified situation for many of the urban Wixárika migrants. Algo más que se podría decir sobre la importancia de Zitácua dentro de la producción artística.
Y pues Zitácua es un lugar donde viven puros indígenas de diferentes pueblos.
And Zitácua today is a neighborhood where indigenous people from different communities, different indigenous, we would call tribes, live.
De hecho, como mi papá fue uno de los fundadores de esta comunidad, invitó gente de diferentes sierras a formar esta comunidad de puros indígenas, un lugar donde ahora es turístico.
And her father also invited people to come and live in that neighborhood from the different highland communities, and it is now a tourism destination.
Pues hoy me encuentro aquí en su taller, en el lugar donde trabajaba, el lugar donde me inspiro.
And it is there that she is, in his workshop. It is the place where he created his artwork, and it is the place where she continues to be inspired. Maymi, ¿podrías compartir con nosotros un poco del proceso artístico, de la selección de colores, de temática? I wanted to now ask Maymi if she could share a little bit about the process of creating these works, right? The process of selecting colors, of figuring out the themes that she's going to be depicting.
Sí, claro. Bueno, en mis obras, cuando yo comienzo a hacer un trabajo de cuadros, mi papá era el que soñaba, yo no puedo soñar como él, es muy diferente.
So this is actually really important. In Wixárika tradition, dreaming is very, very, very powerful. And her father had a gift for dreaming that she does not have. He would often repeat what he had dreamt.
Cuando yo trabajo, pues a base de la madera y la cera, voy dándole forma con el hilo. No tengo una idea específica de lo que voy a plasmar. Solo cuando estoy trabajando se va dando Ya cuando me doy cuenta, ya está terminado el cuadro con el hilo y la figura.
So when she does her pieces, she really works organically. She improvises as she goes. She doesn't start with a set idea of what she wants, but it actually develops as she begins to create the characters and the themes.
Sí. Y ya pues, se forma la figura, se forma ya la historia que se formó. En base a eso le voy dando color. Si se plasma una vida, pues son muchos colores llamativos.
So from there, she creates her figures. She determines the color. For example, if she's representing something having to do with life, she makes sure that she has many vibrant colors.
Sí, aprendí de mi papá que también se plasma oscuridad, colores opacos, que son donde hay dolor, hay donde no hay vida. Es cuando se usamos los colores opacos.
Mm-hmm. And she learned from her father that when you're discussing suffering or death, you use dark and opaque colors.
Sí, bueno, ya una vez terminando el arte, la obra, pues plasmamos la historia, el significado, el mensaje que nos está dando más que nada.
Mm-hmm. And it is through that she really is able to show the message that she wants to develop more than anything. Y quizás ahí también muchos artistas hacen primero la figura, el trazado, pero tú no haces un trazado, ¿verdad?
No, yo no hago un trazado, yo con el mismo hilo, haciendo una figura, aparte de esa figura empieza todo. Es como un hilito que se ve.
And one of the things that Maymi does that few artists, or I don't know of any artists that do it just like her, most artists actually stencil out and they draw the figure that they're going to put the thread on beforehand on the wax. And she actually just freestyles. She does not pre-draw what she's going to put the yarn on. And so she has a very dynamic and improvised style. We're going to go into our last question. So if people have any last Q&A, we're about to start. So if there's any kind of burning questions that you'd like to ask Maymi, she's particularly interested in that too. Ya vamos a la última. ¿Cuáles son ventajas o retos que tú enfrentas como artista, mujer y Wixárika? What are some of the challenges or the opportunities that you face as a female and Wixárika artist?
Sí, pues cuando, bueno, una de las cosas, y cuando mi papá falleció, no me quedaron esas ganas de seguir trabajando, de seguir sus obras. Me parece imposible seguir sus pasos.
So one of the things that's been hard is when her father passed, she found it a big challenge to keep up with his remarkable legacy.
Sí. Un día lo soñé y él sentado sobre una roca vestido de traje elegante, típico, todo un chamán. me dijo que él estaba viendo lo que estábamos haciendo y que estaba contento. Fue lo que me motivó a seguir adelante con sus obras. Fue lo que me motivó a estar ahorita aquí trabajando, representándome a mí y a él también.
Gracias. So she says that she did have a dream where she saw him sitting on a rock in his traditional elegant shaman clothes. And in that dream, he told her that he was very pleased with the work that they were doing. And that really inspired her to keep working, to uphold his legacy, to represent herself as an individual artist, but also to keep representing his artistry. ¿Algún reto que quisieras compartir o algo diferente?
Sí, sí, pues lo que yo quiero es que las figuras de mi papá, las que él representaba, no se pierdan, seguirlas haciendo como él las plasmaba, que ya hoy en día ya se van perdiendo he visto que se van perdiendo algunas obras y es más como que actualizándolos. Y entonces yo no quiero eso, yo quiero seguir con lo que él comenzó y así terminar.
Mm-hmm. And what's really important for her is that she wants his figures to not disappear, as you all could have maybe seen in the images that we were able to share. He had a very, very particular aesthetic, and she really wants to make sure that that's not lost, and that her kind of pursuit is to keep those figures, to keep that aesthetic alive through her own practice. Muchas gracias, Maymi.
De nada, gracias a usted.
Thank you. So I guess this is the part where Patrick comes on and helps mediate the Q&A. There's so much more to talk about, but hopefully there's some good questions that Maymi and I can help address.
All right. Oh, such wonderful, wonderful presence and presentation. So I want to thank Diana and Maymi for bestowing these gifts on us, and also to the audience. Lots of great questions. So I want to jump right into them, and because we have the pleasure of having Maymi here present, I want to start with a couple of quick questions to Maymi that Diana will translate. And so the first one, and certainly a very important one, is a question as to where people could possibly see and purchase some of Maymi's work. And so in what way might that be accessible to people?
Entonces la primera pregunta para ti es, Maymi, que tiene el público, ¿dónde pueden ver y conseguir tus obras? El micrófono.
Estamos aquí en la comunidad Zitácua de Tepic, Nayarit, México, en Mujer Anciana número 1, de calle Tacutzinacahue y Peregrino.
So she's giving y'all her address. She's in Colonia Zitácua. It's number 1. It's the first house because it was her dad's house. Remember, he's one of the founders of this community. So it's number 1 Tacutzinacahue Street. It's right in front of the temple. And that's where she's located. If people go to Tepic, it's just north of Puerto Vallarta. ¿Algún otro lugar? ¿Tu Instagram o redes?
Como Maymi Benitez, y pues también tenemos una página, Las Huellas de José Benítez, que somos el legado de los hijos. Ahí nos pueden encontrar, y en Instagram igual como Maymi Benitez.
So she's on Instagram under her name, Maymi Benitez, and also she and her family have started an Instagram page called Las Huellas de José Benítez, which also means the footprints of José Benítez. And we have been doing this week, we're going to finalize a series of her artwork that we've also been sharing on the Chacruna Institute social media. So little by little, that's where you can start seeing some of her work.
Wonderful. Also, a question was raised about whether Maymi or Jose have worked with beads, and also maybe how far back in Huichol tradition does the use of beads go?
Very good question. Entonces, una pregunta para ti, si tú o tu papá han trabajado con Shakira y si sabes cuándo empezó la tradición de Shakira, de usar Shakira.
Pues la tradición de Shakira pues ya viene desde antes, desde que ahorita ya son los hijos los que están trabajando la Shakira. Ya esta colonia pues tiene más de 30 años. Yo sé que desde antes ya lo practicaban. Entonces tiene mucho tiempo.
¿Y tú has trabajado con Shakira?
He trabajado con Shakira, he trabajado con estambres para hacer morrales, pero no se me dio. Se me dio más por el cuadro de estambre de Wixárika.
¿Y tu papá? Yo nunca he visto trabajo de Shakira, ¿sabes si él lo exploró?
No, él solo se dedicó a los cuadros murales.
Yeah, so this is a great question because I think a lot of people relate Wixárika artwork with the beaded pieces that we see on the tourist market. And Maymi explains that Shakira really, you know, it's been used really for 30 years, even though it started to get adopted earlier, right, in beadwork, but as kind of marketed artwork, it's really kind of 30 years to the present. She's played around with it. She's also worked a little bit with weaving the traditional bags, but it's really not her thing. And her father definitely didn't work with Shakira as a medium. And the image that I showed earlier of the Ñerica, that's actually with beadwork. So that's like a very traditional way in which you could see beadwork being used.
Excellent. And following up on the question about beads then is, how far back does the tradition of putting yarn onto boards and painting with yarn, sort of how did that tradition come about?
Entonces esta otra pregunta es, ¿cuándo empezó la tradición de hacer cuadros de estambre?
Pues desde que mi papá tiene él dijo que él nos platicaba que él comenzó ya cuando tenía los 14 años, el llamado, él decía que ya era para hacer maracame, entonces a partir de ahí empezó ya las ideas de hacer muchas cosas aparte de ser un artista.
So to answer that question on her and on her father's end, the yarn paintings that he began was when he was 14 years old. He began that first as kind of a entry into spirituality, ritual, tradition. And that's when he started working on it. But yes, definitely it was precisely when her father was young, when José Benítez was young, that the yarn painting as a genre really emerged. It was in the 1950s. It was based on these Ñerica offerings, and it was actually the role of the National Institute of Anthropology, led by this one anthropologist, Alfonso Sotosoria, as well as some Franciscans who started to push the idea of how could these artistic depictions be placed in a more kind of marketable format. And so the idea was something that you can hang on a wall. And that's where you get the square yarn paintings in the 1950s. But it's really in the late 60s and early 70s that it takes off. And José Benítez, again, is a pioneer.
What I want to do now is ask a couple of questions directed to you, Diana, but also if you feel also to want to bring Maymi in to add to them, please do so. And the first one is a question about Wixárika space and territory. And so the question was asked about the plateau of Tepic, and is it prohibitive for people to enter without government permission? So and
we're talking about where to enter without government permission?
The plateau of Tepic. And so I think the larger question is, one thing is in terms of access and of Huichol access to traditional territories like Huiraputa. And so maybe are there tensions of access and use to land?
Esta pregunta es un poco para mí, pero también si quieres añadirle, la pregunta tiene que ver con territorio y acceso a lugares sagrados, ¿verdad? Si hay, ¿cuáles son los retos, ¿no? Para poder acceder a los territorios sagrados. Well, as I was mentioning, there are series of land use changes that have occurred over the last hundreds of years, but in particular, I would say in Wixárika territory, this is something that we've seen develop in the last several decades. And Wixárika territory has always been a shared territory. It's not coordinates that they claim as property just for themselves. They share these lands with others. And so since time immemorial, they have always, as they've made these pilgrimages to these extended sacred lands, away from their ranches, they've always been adept at negotiating with whoever lives in those places. The problem is when you start to erect fences or you destroy hilltops, right? Or there's no longer access, right? And that is something that is occurring and that they have organized around for quite some time. not demanding that these places be seen as property of the Wixárika people, but as shared territories that should be protected, not just for Wixárika culture, but because in their view, keeping these places in a state of conservation and protection is also connected to our larger battle around climate change and the protection of our environment. No sé si quieras decir algo tú en torno a eso, al territorio.
Pues ahorita nosotros no dejamos que se esté perdiendo o que estén invadiendo más que nada ahorita uno de los lugares sagrados más importantes. Es la preocupación ahorita de todos. Entonces, pues hay una lucha ahí que no vamos a bajar la guardia.
So yeah, just she's reiterating just the importance that it is for them to keep struggling for their territory and to not let down their guard with respect to these struggles.
Thank you. We've been getting a lot of great questions, and so unfortunately we have time for one last one. I do hope that people will take the opportunity to reach out to Maymi through her professional site and the contact information, because I know that I think that there's a lot of interest in people better understanding Wixárika art and artists. And so the last question really goes to the reality of Wixárika creativity and I think religion in a global market and an increasingly interactive, engaged atmosphere. And so the question is there any protection from cheap imitations of Wixárika art? In other words, the issue of intellectual property.
Yeah, great question. Entonces, la última pregunta, tienen muchas preguntas y comentarios en torno a tu trabajo, el contenido, la simbología, entonces invitamos al público a que te sigan, te sigan, pero ahí la última pregunta tiene que ver un poco con ahora los derechos que tienen ustedes como artistas y la cuestión de apropiaciones o distorsiones, ¿no? Del arte wixárika, ¿no? Pensando en el mercado global, pensando obviamente en todas las tecnologías actuales, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son las cuestiones de derecho de autor, ¿no? Que se enfrenta ahorita con la cultura wixárika?
Pues ahorita las obras que estamos haciendo en algunas partes no nos piden el derecho de autor, ¿verdad? Es por eso que a veces tenemos ese problema de que nos van, ¿cómo se dice? Como copiando nuestra arte, y a veces sí es un problema para nosotros. Entonces, es por eso que yo cuando hago una obra, pues sí le pongo firma, la fecha y todo, para evitarnos ese tipo de problemas de que nos anden como diciendo, haciéndose pasar por nosotros, más que nada. Entonces, cada obra que hacemos, bueno, cada obra que yo hago, no es lo mismo.
Mm-hmm. So what she does, and what's really important, this is a practice, I know we're wrapping up, a practice that Juan Negrín and José Benítez really emphasized was signing and dating their paintings, you know, making sure these are one-of-a-kind creations. They're not replicable in a serial format. And certainly that is a big question. And I've actually written a little bit about that in the past as a scholar, right? The way in which New Balance, Vans, Nike, they've all done Wixárika themed sneakers. To what extent do any of those royalties reach the creators, the artists, the community, right? So you know, for her as an artist, she just ensures to make sure that her authorship is known. But when we start looking at replicas and, you know, kind of the more global market, that's definitely a contentious issue that a lot of people are struggling with. and indigenous culture is kind of like this double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's still a denial of certain spaces for these artists, but on the other hand, there's a big thirst for folkloric tribal imagery, right? So in many ways, we're up against many of the same struggles that Jose and Juan, my father, were up against when they first met in the early 1970s.
Wonderful.
It was such an honor to hear from you both today, Diana and Maymi. Thank you, muchas gracias, for joining us and telling us so much about your research and practice. And of course, Jose, we so appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. And a big thank you to Diana for translating so we could hear from Maymi. Of course, we couldn't imagine this program without including Maymi. So thank you for helping us out with that as well. And Patrick, thanks for helping us out with the Q&A. And a big thank you to the hundreds of guests who joined us today. This program has been recorded. It will be available immediately on our Facebook, and in about a week or so, it will be uploaded to our Instagram and on the Fowler website for you to revisit and share. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next program. Details can be found on the closing slide. Have a great day, everyone. See you next time. Adios.
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 Adiós.